My first guest is celebrating the life of Paul Cuffee later this month, and she's inviting all of us to join in. Lee Blake is the president of the New Bedford Historical Society. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you.
For those who don't know, and there are probably many people who may not know who Paul Cuffee is, but in reading up on his life, it's an amazing life for sure. What is his connection to the Southcoast? Tell us a little bit about Paul Cuffee.
Paul Cuffee was born in 1759 and died in 1817. He was one of the wealthiest African Americans on the South Coast. He lived in Westport. His business interests were in the maritime trades, in whaling, in agriculture, up and down the East Coast. He also was well known for being involved in philanthropy around this region, but also in other parts of the country and in Africa. The other thing is that Paul Cuffee was involved in integrating the schools and developing the school system in Westport. There's lots of different points of interest that Cuffee was involved in his short 57-year lifespan.
He also fought the British during the Revolution.
He fought the British. He fought pirates in the Revolution. He was involved in the Revolutionary War. He also put in a petition for the right for African Americans and Native Americans to vote in 1780. He and his brothers were actually in jail because they refused to pay their taxes because they wanted the right to vote before Henry David Thoreau, way before Henry David Thoreau. They served, I think, about 3 months in jail, but they were the impetus, along with several other African Americans, including Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman, who got the Massachusetts Senate to pass a bill ending slavery in the United States, in Massachusetts in 1783.
A remarkable life.
Remarkable. There's so many different points of interest.
Paul Cuffee Day is being celebrated in Westport on September 16th. And it's this event really is a collaboration, a wonderful collaboration by historical societies in New Bedford, Dartmouth, and Westport. What will happen on the 16th?
So the New Bedford Historical Society, Dartmouth Historical Society, Westport Historical Society, and the Westport Historical Commission, all came together several years ago, actually, in 2009, and we did our first national symposium on Paul Cuffee because we didn't want Cuffee as a historical figure to disappear. We wanted to raise him up. We wanted to give him visibility. We wanted to connect him firmly to the South Coast and to Westport. He also had business interests in New Bedford. His store, the Cuffee Howard store, was right down the street from the Whaling Museum. So we wanted people to see the connections between Cuffee fighting for the rights of African Americans and Native Americans and New Bedford and Westport. So we've all come together. In many ways, we're all small organizations leveraging our volunteer resources, the funding that we have to do an exhibit on Cuffee, but also to raise his profile in the region.
So where will this activity take place?
So it'll take place in Westport at the Westport Friends Meeting House, which is a place that Cuffee funded when he was alive. It's a wonderful meeting house. We've done events there before. So it will take place there. It is a symposium initially in the morning. We'll have speakers who have new books coming out on Cuffee's impact. So Lamont Thomas, who has written one of the best-known books on Cuffee, Rise to Be a People, has a new volume coming out with scholars from around the country writing about Cuffee's impact on American history, on international history. We also have Dr. Jeffrey Fortin from Emmanuel College. We have several other people, including Christopher Nagin from France, who has written a book on the Liberian colony, who's coming. He heard about the conference. He wanted to be here.
So we're going to talk to you about that colony in just a moment. But Paul Cuffee, fighting the British, fighting pirates, a landowner, businessman, owned a boat building
Firm,
company. Is that
right?
Is that right?
Right.
Yeah. Which was in New Bedford,
Mm-hmm.
and some say the wealthiest African American of his time.
Right.
That is remarkable, given the landscape, if you will, of African Americans in the United States, and also, of course, they weren't the United States then, so to speak, but.
So in 1810, when he has,
Well, they were then,
1810, when he's doing some of his most important work, there are 1.1 million enslaved people just in the United States. So he is one of the about the 6,000 free African Americans in Massachusetts. So his family, Cuffy's family, his father, Cuffy Slocum, had been a slave, had been brought from Ghana when he was about 14. So Cuffy had that whole direct link to slavery, looking just at his parents, at his father. So he had that whole direct link. But at the same point in time, during his lifetime, he was able to really achieve a certain amount of notoriety, a certain amount of entrepreneurship that one would not expect it at that time. So he does talk about that, and he does use his wealth and his connections to build the meeting house, to have integrated, to help build schools in Westport, to work with widows. Some of the things that he did were really amazing, helping other people to buy property, saving property that was because a woman had lost her husband or something like that. He would then step in and take care of that family, whether they were black or white. It didn't matter to him. The idea was to spread the wealth and to take care of people. And he did that mostly in Westport, but also in New Bedford and Dartmouth.
You are listening to Townsquare Sunday. My guest is Lee Blake, the president of the New Bedford Historical Society. In the early 1800s, Cuffy joined the Quakers in Westport. That correct?
Yes.
Did that somehow transform the rest of his life, Lee?
Well, actually, he joins the Quakers about 1810. And it's not so much that it transforms his life. It's that he was friends with William Roach Jr. He was friends with a lot of the important Quakers at the time who accepted him as an individual and as a human being, and did not necessarily look at his skin color as an impediment. So he understood that using the network of the Quakers, and the Quakers at the time were very accepting and were willing to work with people regardless of color, because they believed that everyone was a child of God. What we say now, but they actually believe that. What we say now. But Cuffy was able to use the network of the Quakers. And in that network, you also have really important centers of industry. So, for instance, the Philadelphia Quakers, those were people that he aligned himself with, and so did other African Americans in Philadelphia. So you see, when you look at Cuffy, you see that he was friends with a lot of the important African Americans who were also working with the Quakers up and down the East Coast. And you also see him working with the Quakers who were white Quakers. Cuffy is the only person in the region that was accepted into the Friends actual Quakers. There are other people who applied but had never been actually accepted. So you had to go through a series of meetings and interviews, and then people would say, yes, you're a Quaker. That did not happen for other people, but it did happen in Westport with Cuffy.
He devised a plan, I guess it was with his brother, to resettle free blacks in Africa, Sierra Leone in Africa. A British colony at that time. He actually spoke to the British. He worked this all out. Kind of a remarkable thing when you figure, in the early 1800s, when we didn't have the kinds of communication and transportation that we certainly have now. And he actually brought 58 people there in 1816. How was that concept met by others in this country?
Well, towards the end of his life, towards the end of Cuffy's life, he really thought a lot about how he could make an impact on enslavement, how he could impact slavery. And one of the thoughts that he had was how do you change the dynamics of the triangular trade at the time, which was the Middle Passage? And one of the thoughts that he had was, if you could go to Africa and bring the skills, the literacy skills, Christianity, the economics, the agricultural skills to parts of Africa, maybe that would change the dynamics. And he starts with Sierra Leone. He does go and meet with some of the English abolitionists and people in England who had already ended enslavement in England, and talk to them about this whole idea of transporting newly freed enslaved people from the United States to Sierra Leone and to work with them there. There were freed Africans there, some of whom had been loyalists during the American Revolution that the British had brought over to Sierra Leone after being in Nova Scotia for a while. So he thought the dynamics could change if he was able to bring those skills over. So initially, what he does is he works with 38 families here in the United States who are freed slaves and brings them to Sierra Leone. And hopefully, his hope was that they would develop this whole skill-based and a whole economic model that would be different. And it's unfortunate that Cuffy dies. So he's only able to do 2 voyages, but he had plans for many more. But it was this whole thinking of how do you change the whole trade route that had been going on for almost 400 years by then of selling human beings. How do you change that?
And he had an idea.
He did. He had an idea.
This man was way ahead of his time. I don't think there's much debate about that. Lee, you and the Historical Society, perhaps best known for promoting the life of Frederick Douglass, perhaps the nation's most famous abolitionist. You do an annual readathon, which is a wonderful event. You have you operate out of I think it's the Polly Johnson home,
right,
where Douglass lived,
right,
for a time when he was in New Bedford. And you recently cut a ribbon on a small park in the West End in an area some would call Abolitionist Row. How is that awareness project going, and what's in the future?
Well, one of the things that it's a theme throughout all of our work is what we're doing is we're reclaiming African American history. We're reclaiming the history of people of color in our region, in the Southcoast, and also, of course, in New Bedford, but working on the 54th Regiment Wall, making sure that those components of history are better known and that people understand the impact of African Americans and Cape Verdeans and Native Americans had to the history here. We are helping to open up the narrative of New Bedford history by making it a more inclusive history. So with Abolition Park, what we did essentially is 7th Street, where Nathan and Polly Johnson lived, 7th Street has 19 historic homes on it that are all been documented by the New Bedford Preservation Society, many of whom were abolitionists, many of whom worked very vociferously as advocates for the anti-slavery movement. So we're really kind of designating a whole new historic area for the city of New Bedford. So in many ways, that's a tourist spot. In many ways, that's a place where people can come and think about how active individuals were in the 19th century to change the dynamics of this country. So we're really proud to be able to do that, and we're looking forward to how much fun that will be. As you asked, where are we now? So we bought the land. We are starting an archaeological dig on the land in October, and we'll be working with school children, so they'll get to see what an archaeologist does and why it's important to do a dig before you do a big project. You never know what you're going to find, and of course we're hoping that we find things. But we'll be working to fundraise. This will become a park that tells the story of the abolitionist movement in New Bedford, but also we will have a statue finally of Frederick Douglass in the park.
It's a wonderful thing. What do you hope to find with the dig? I mean, you hope to find something. What do you hope to find?
So the dig is going to be on the property that belonged to Alyssa Thornton. And Alyssa Thornton was a abolitionist who, in his basement, what he did was he trained people to be pharmacists. And we know that he trained several African American fugitive slaves to be pharmacists. So we're hoping that we find some of his little pharmacy jars. Maybe we find some buttons. Maybe we find some shards of pottery that belong to him. We know where the privy for that house is. And privies often are wonderful places where people used to throw their garbage. So we're hoping that we find some of these items that will help document that site.
September 16th, Paul Cuffee Day in Westport. Tell us the particulars about that one more time.
All right, so September 16th, Saturday, the registration site is at the Westport Historical Society. We need people to register if they're coming, but we will have guest speakers who are actually writing or ready to launch new books on Cuffy. We have our keynote speaker is Vanessa July, who is from the Quakers, National Quakers Meeting House, who will come and talk on the impact of Cuffy and also on the Quakers. We have a number of people coming to speak. We also have this whole wonderful genealogical presentation on how Cuffy was related to a lot of the advocates who came after him that fought for democracy in this country. So a lot of the African American captains married into the Cuffy family, people who were lawyers, people who were other philanthropists, were married into the Cuffy family. It was a large family when you look at it. Paul Cuffy had 9 brothers and sisters, and they all married. They all had this wonderful genealogy, and the contacts and the continuity of people who advocated for social justice. And I think that's a wonderful legacy to look at, as well as all the things that Cuffy did himself.
My guest has been Lee Blake of the New Bedford Historical Society. You can join her and many others celebrating the life of Paul Cuffy on September 16th in Westport. Thanks for coming in, Lee.
Thank you so much for having us and for promoting local history.
Our pleasure. Thank you.